Well, let's take a closer look now at the restrictions on Huawei and how the company is faring overall. I'm joined by Sean Ding, the co-founder and CEO of GRisk. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Rachelle.
So what do you think today's data about Huawei tells us about the company's overall health?
Well, when it comes to Huawei, I think it would make sense to take a step back and look at the overall revenue streams of the company. Now, 50% of Huawei's revenue comes from their consumer business. And those are the smartphones that they're selling. 40% comes from the carrier business or the operator business. Another 10% coming from enterprise sales. Now, the number that we've seen today, 23% growth, $58 billion in sales, means that the company is still financially strong. And the first piece, the consumer market, is what's being affected the most by the U.S. sanctions or by the U.S. pressure. The second piece, for the carrier business, Huawei is actually a lot less dependent on U.S. suppliers, on U.S. technology. And another 10%, same goes with that. It depends less on U.S. technology. So with this in mind, it's not really surprising that Huawei is still achieving a satisfactory growth trajectory for the first half of the year. But what comes next is really something that we are still watching out for.
And we certainly did see that Huawei's chairman, Liang Hua, admitted that the second half of the year would come with its challenges. What do you think are going to be the biggest issues that may drag on Huawei for the rest of 2019?
Well, I think obviously the Android ban is still the single most daunting challenge that they're facing. Huawei just a few days ago launched the smart display at the GMIC, the Global Mobile Internet Conference in Guangzhou. They announced that they're going to test the Hongmeng operating system on basically a smart television. And now that is a safe space for Huawei to testing out new operating systems without hitting the massive phone market that they're in. But is that going to be successful? Is that going to actually help Huawei replace Android if the ban does not get lifted? That's the biggest challenge that they're facing.
And so what are they doing in terms of R&D to try and offset some of the tensions between the U.S. and the company?
Well, like I said earlier, they're testing a lot of these new technologies that has been in the labs for the past few years. Their new chipsets, their new video processors that they're using on the new smartphones, the 5G phone that they just launched, as well as these new smart displays. I think Huawei recognizes that the smartphone market is shrinking. In China, is declining in double digit. Really, last year I think it declined about 11 to 12%, depending on what data you use. So they're trying to really expand beyond that market, testing out their technology, testing out the results of their R&D in different products, because that is the future when 5G becomes reality. You're not going to be communicating just on your phone, but rather in your cars, in your homes, with your television, your refrigerator. A lot of the so-called Internet of Things are going to be the new playground, the new market for Huawei.
And speaking of 5G, we know that the U.S. had been putting pressure on allies to not use Huawei in some of its systems. Talk about how Huawei's relationships with other countries is at the moment.
Well, I think Huawei is trying very hard to convince other countries that U.S. concern is not grounded. Now, there have been some discoveries of bugs in Huawei's operating system, but that's just true across any technology provider. I think the UK is now saying that we're not going to just ban Huawei across the board. I think there are a lot of conversations going on. These are actually very healthy conversations that I think governments should be having with any technology provider, not just Huawei, but Google, Facebook, anyone who has a lot of data, personal data, as well as company data at their disposal.
Now, what about Huawei regaining ground in the U.S. community? Is it still possible to do that as the tensions are ongoing? And what about consumers who, perhaps in the U.S., who hadn't really heard about Huawei until this really flared up?
Well, I think in terms of consumer tech, Huawei, U.S. is probably not on top of Huawei's list because they're doing just fine in China. They still have 30% of the Chinese smartphone market share. They're doing pretty well in Africa and Latin America. So I don't think the U.S. will be the top of their consumer product market. But that being said, I think there is a lot of opportunity for the 5G infrastructure if the U.S. is willing to sort of take a renewed approach toward examining some of these so-called national security concerns with Huawei and have a conversation with the company and other tech stakeholders as well to figure out exactly how to leverage Huawei's technology in 5G without jeopardizing national security, without jeopardizing privacy. I think that's a very healthy conversation that everybody should be having.
Now, instead, people seem to be having a conversation where they're conflating what's happening with Huawei with overall US-China trade tensions. Tell us about that distinction and why it's important to make that.
Well, technology governance or digital governance is a global issue that every single government, every single country needs to be dealing with and needs to tackle. And the US-China trade war, I think unfortunately Huawei became a leverage to a certain extent for both countries. Now, if that becomes the norm, if all countries start to engage each other by saying, okay, my technology cannot be used in your country or yours cannot be trusted in my country, that's going to result in something that I've repetitively said, the balkanization of technology, where each country, each region would have their own standards. And the end result is a tremendous loss of value, tremendous loss of actual progress that technology can bring to society and to mankind.
Certainly it would be a sad downside. Thank you so much.
Indeed.
Always good to have
Thank
you.
you.
Sean Ding there, co-founder and CEO of GRisk.